There is a precise moment during a long-haul flight when the connection to the terrestrial world completely evaporates. It usually happens somewhere over the grand, empty expanse of the Canadian tundra or the featureless black of the North Atlantic, long after the cabin lights have been dimmed and the passengers have fallen into a heavy, artificial sleep. At 37,000 feet, suspended in a pressurized aluminum tube traveling at 500 miles per hour, reality narrows down to the faint, omnipresent drone of two massive jet engines and the soft, green bioluminescence of the cockpit instruments. Up there, the sky isn't blue, and it isn't black. It is a vast, predatory void that gently detaches you from the passage of time. My name is Arthur, and until recently I was a senior captain for a major international cargo carrier. For nearly 20 years, my life was measured in flight levels, fuel burn rates, and oceanic crossing coordinates. I preferred the cargo routes. Air freight doesn't complain about delays, it doesn't get air sick, and it doesn't require a polite announcement from the flight deck when you hit a pocket of rough air. You fly with a crew of two, sometimes three, moving millions of dollars of industrial equipment, medical supplies, or sealed corporate containers across the planet while the rest of humanity is asleep. It was a sterile, highly predictable profession, governed by strict checklists and the unwavering mathematical precision of modern avionics. 4 months ago, I was assigned to pilot Flight 804, a non-stop repositioning and heavy freight run from Anchorage, Alaska, to a remote logistics hub in northern Scotland. It was a grueling polar route that would take us directly over the uninhabited, frozen crown of the Earth. Because the aircraft, a heavily modified Boeing 777 freighter, was carrying an exceptionally light payload of specialized electronic components, the corporate dispatch team made a highly unusual decision. To cut costs on the return leg, my first officer, a sharp but quiet young man named David, and I would be flying the route entirely alone, without a relief crew or a cabin supercargo specialist. The first 4 hours of the flight were textbook. We climbed out of Anchorage into a clear, freezing twilight, watching the jagged, snow-covered peaks of the Alaskan wilderness recede into a sea of endless white clouds. By the time we leveled off at our initial cruising altitude of flight level 360, the sun had dipped below the horizon, plunging the world outside our windshield into an absolute, starless darkness. David handled the radio check-ins with Arctic control, while I monitored the flight management computer, ensuring our trajectory perfectly aligned with the invisible waypoints mapped across the polar grid. The environment inside a modern cockpit is designed to minimize human fatigue, but the ambient atmosphere can be intensely hypnotic. The air is dry, tasting faintly of ozone and recycled plastic. The cockpit seats, wrapped in thick sheepskin, absorb every minor tremor of the airframe. Once the aircraft stabilizes on its oceanic track, the autopilot takes complete control of the control columns, making micro-adjustments so smooth that the human hand can barely detect them. You become an observer, a biological backup system, to a network of triple redundant flight computers that are vastly more capable of navigating the sky than you are. It was exactly 0214 Coordinated Universal Time when the primary flight display began to exhibit an anomaly. David was resting his chin against his hand, staring out into the black void, when a subtle amber caution light illuminated on the central console. It wasn't a master warning, nor was it a mechanical failure alert. It was a status indicator for the satellite communications array, the high-frequency data link that kept the aircraft connected to global tracking networks and company dispatch. The system wasn't reporting a hardware malfunction, it was reporting a total loss of signal. David sat up, his fingers dancing across the control display unit to force a manual reset of the satellite receiver. He tried bouncing a secondary signal off the high-frequency global radio net, but the speakers didn't return the familiar, comforting crackle of a distant air traffic controller. They returned an absolute, freezing silence. We were completely out of range of any ground-based radar, which was normal for the polar route, but a simultaneous failure of both the satellite data link and the high-frequency radio backup was statistically impossible. I reached up and checked our position on the navigation display. We were currently passing through waypoint November Delta 60, an invisible coordinate situated directly above the geographic center of the Arctic Ocean. According to our onboard charts, the nearest human settlement was a weather station on a frozen island over 700 miles to our south. I decided not to panic. Aviation redundancy exists for a reason, and our inertial navigation systems, which rely on internal gyroscopes rather than external satellite signals, were still showing our track with perfect accuracy. We were a self-contained island in the sky, perfectly capable of navigating to Scotland without talking to a single human soul on the ground. But then, the autopilot did something it was never programmed to do. Without any input from either of our control columns, and without any change in our programmed flight plan, the aircraft smoothly initiated a bank to the left. The control wheels in front of us rotated precisely 12 degrees, holding the plane in a shallow, uncoordinated turn. I leaned forward, checking the flight management computer to see if the system had automatically entered a weather deviation or a tactical holding pattern. The screen was completely normal. The magenta line representing our path still pointed straight ahead toward Northern Europe. I reached out and firmly grasped the control wheel, clicking the thumb switch to disconnect the autopilot system. A loud, repetitive cavalry charge alarm should have blared through the cockpit speakers, signaling that the human pilot had taken manual control of the aircraft. The alarm never sounded. The control wheel felt incredibly stiff beneath my palms, locked into place by the powerful hydraulic actuators of the fly-by-wire system. I pulled back, attempting to override the computer with physical force, but the metal column didn't budge an inch. I looked over at David, my voice tight with an urgency I hadn't felt in 20 years of flying. I told him to pull the primary flight computer circuit breakers, located on the panel directly behind his seat. David scrambled out of his harness, dropping to his knees in the narrow space behind the pedestal, searching the massive wall of toggles for the specific switches that would cut power to the automated navigation logic. He found them, pulling 3 heavy black buttons out of the panel. The screens should have flickered, dropping the aircraft into an unassisted, manual flight mode. The displays remained bright green. The control wheels continued to turn on their own, guided by an invisible logic that bypassed every physical and electronic breaker in the airframe. The aircraft leveled off from its uncommanded turn, settling onto a new heading of exactly 360. We were flying due north, directly toward the pole, away from our destination, away from any alternate landing strips, and deeper into the empty heart of the Arctic void. I checked our fuel telemetry. Because we were carrying an exceptionally light cargo load, we had nearly 7 hours of reserve fuel remaining, but at our current speed, flying north meant we would eventually run out of air over the deep ice pack of the Arctic Ocean, far beyond the reach of any rescue operations. Suddenly, the central multifunction display cleared itself of all navigation data. The colorful map, the wind vectors, and the waypoint markers vanished, replaced by a single line of stark white text generated by the core operating system. The text did not conform to standard Boeing maintenance codes or system alerts. It read simply, "Protocol engaged. Search parameters defined." I stared at the screen, a cold dread trickling down my spine. I reached for the digital audio control panel, turning the volume of the overhead speakers to maximum, hopping against hope that some distant air traffic control facility could hear our emergency transponder broadcasts. But the radio didn't produce static. It began to emit a rhythmic, pulsing tone that vibrated in the soles of my shoes. It was a low-frequency, digital chirp, repeating every 4 seconds. It sounded exactly like an active sonar ping from a submarine, echoing through the small, enclosed space of the flight deck. David crawled back into his seat, his face completely pale, his hands trembling as he buckled his 5-point harness back into place. He looked out of his side window, then leaned across the console, his eyes wide with a manic intensity. He told me to look down. I leaned over my side of the control wheel, pressing my forehead against the cold acrylic of the front windshield, straining my eyes to look through the absolute darkness toward the frozen surface of the Earth 37,000 feet below us. The Arctic Ocean should have been a featureless, uniform sheet of black and white ice, completely invisible under the cloud layer. But as I watched, a shape began to manifest through the gaps in the mist. It wasn't a city, and it wasn't the lights of a surface vessel. It was a massive, perfectly geometric circle of pale, blue luminescence glowing from deep beneath the ice pack. The scale of the light was immense, stretching across miles of the frozen ocean, casting a faint, ghostly radiance upward into the cloud deck. As the aircraft flew directly toward the center of the ring, the pulsing sonar tone in our speakers grew faster, sharper, and progressively louder, shifting into a high-pitched metallic whine that made our teeth ache. The flight management computer screen flickered once more, updating its white text interface. It read, "Target acquired, initiating descent." The nose of the aircraft pitched forward violently. The vertical speed indicator on my display snapped downward, showing a terrifying descent rate of 7,000 feet per minute. The airframe began to vibrate heavily as our speed accelerated toward the structural limits of the fuselage. The wind outside roared against the windshield, a deafening metallic shriek that drowned out the hum of the engines. I grabbed the thrust levers, pulling them completely back to the idle position to slow our descent. The levers moved smoothly under my hand, but the engine instruments showed that the massive turbofans were still spinning at 98% power. The computer had completely locked us out of the throttle quadrant. We plummeted through 30,000 feet, then 25,000. The cabin altitude warning horn began to blare, a harsh, discordant klaxon that signaled the air pressure inside the fuselage was dropping rapidly. I reached down and pulled the yellow emergency oxygen mask from the ceiling panel, slamming it over my face, inhaling the sharp chemical taste of pure oxygen. David did the same, his breathing ragged and loud through the rubber microphone inside his mask. Through the windshield, the glowing blue circle on the ocean floor grew larger, brighter, and terrifyingly detailed. The ice pack above the light wasn't solid. It was fractured into millions of jagged, concentric rings, as if something incredibly massive had been slowly, repeatedly shifting beneath the surface for centuries, breaking the ice from below. The light wasn't static. It was rippling, swirling inward toward a central, pitch-black vortex that sat directly in the middle of the frozen sea. At 10,000 feet, the aircraft leveled out from its steep dive, with a violent, bone-rattling pull that subjected our bodies to nearly 3 times the force of gravity. My vision blurred at the edges, graying out for a terrifying second before my blood pressure stabilized. The plane was now skimming across the top of the polar ice pack at less than 2,000 feet above the surface, traveling at a lethal speed of nearly 400 knots. The terrain outside was a blur of jagged white ridges and deep black crevices, illuminated by the unnatural blue glow emanating from the water below. The automated sonar ping in the speakers stopped. The cockpit fell into a sudden, suffocating quiet, save for the roar of the wind. Then the main cockpit door behind us clicked. The security lock on the flight deck door is a heavy, electronic bolt system controlled by a digital keypad and an emergency switch on our central console. It requires a high-voltage charge to disengage, and the door itself is reinforced with Kevlar panels designed to withstand a physical breach from a heavy tool. The red lock indicator on the console didn't flash, and nobody had entered a code into the keypad outside. The mechanical bolt simply slid back into the frame with a heavy, metallic thunk. The door swung slowly inward, opening into the pitch-black void of the main cargo deck. Because we were flying a freight route, the area directly behind the cockpit was an empty, unlit vestibule that led into the massive, echoing cavern of the main cargo bay where the sealed corporate containers were secured to the floor tracks. The temperature inside the cockpit instantly plummeted as the door opened, a freezing Arctic draft blowing past my seat, bringing with it a strange, overwhelming smell. It didn't smell like jet fuel, and it didn't smell like hydraulic fluid. It smelled like ancient, stagnant air that had been trapped inside a deep, subterranean vault for thousands of years. David turned around in his seat, his flashlight cutting a bright, narrow beam of white light through the open doorway into the darkness of the cargo bay. The light hit the first row of freight containers. The heavy aluminum boxes were completely undisturbed, their cargo straps tight, their customs seals intact. But as David swept the beam further back into the shadows of the aircraft, the light caught something that shouldn't have been there. Sitting flat on the bare metal floor of the center aisle, directly between 2 massive equipment crates, was a single flight data recorder box. It was a standard, bright orange crash survivability unit, its reflective tape scratched and weathered, its metal housing dented as if it had been pulled from the wreckage of a severe high-impact accident. The unit's locator beacon wire was extended, and from its internal speaker, a faint, metallic voice was broadcasting a repeating loop of corrupted audio data. The voice was human, but it was heavily distorted by digital static and a strange, rhythmic underwater gurgle. It was a radio transmission code, repeating the same phrase over and over again into the dark of the plane. It was my voice. The recording was broadcasting a standard emergency distress call, using my specific airline call sign, my name, and my license number. But the coordinates it was listing weren't for Scotland, and they weren't for Alaska. It was reading out the exact latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates of the glowing blue vortex that was currently passing directly beneath our wings. The audio loop ended with a sudden, violent sound of rushing water and metal tearing apart, followed by a long, hollow silence, before starting over again. David dropped his flashlight. The heavy aluminum torch rolled across the cockpit floor, its beam casting long, frantic shadows against the instrument panels. He looked back at me, his eyes entirely consumed by a primal, unadulterated terror, his lips moving soundlessly beneath his rubber oxygen mask. I didn't look back at him. I couldn't. I kept my eyes fixed on the primary flight display. The white text on the screen updated one final time. The system parameters cleared, and a single definitive navigation command appeared across the digital interface. Final approach path locked, terminating biological redundancy. The control columns in front of us violently snapped backward, pulling the nose of the Boeing 777 upward into a vertical, uncoordinated climb that instantly stalled the wings. The aircraft lost all forward lift, its multi-million-dollar engines screaming in protest, as the nose pushed past 70 degrees. The massive airframe began to slide backward through the freezing sky, falling directly toward the center of the geometric blue circle on the ice pack below. The lights inside the cockpit died. The glowing green screens, the amber caution indicators, and the overhead utility lights vanished in an instant, plunging David and me into the absolute, starless dark of the polar night. The only thing left to see was the brilliant, cold blue radiance flooding through the front windshield from the frozen ocean below us. As the aircraft fell toward the open, black vortex in the ice, I didn't feel the sensation of a typical crash. I didn't feel the sudden, crushing impact of metal meeting solid ground. Instead, the airframe seemed to slide smoothly into a dense, viscous medium that completely absorbed the momentum of our descent. The deafening roar of the wind vanished, replaced by a deep, heavy, and terrifyingly familiar acoustic rhythm. It was the sound of millions of gallons of freezing water rushing past the outer aluminum skin of the fuselage. When I finally opened my eyes, the cockpit was bright. The harsh, blinding glare of early morning sunlight was streaming through the windshield, casting a warm, golden glow across the instrument console. I was sitting in the captain's seat, my hands resting flat against the grey plastic trim of the control wheel. The primary flight display was bright green, showing a perfect, stable altitude of 37,000 feet. The magenta line on the navigation screen pointed straight ahead toward our destination. The engine instruments showed a completely normal, efficient fuel burn rate, and the overhead speakers were humming with the soft, comforting chatter of a Scottish air traffic controller, welcoming us into European airspace. The flight was over, we had landed safely. The company logistics team met us at the cargo ramp, unloaded the corporate containers without incident, and congratulated us on completing a highly efficient polar run ahead of schedule. The automated flight logs showed an absolutely flawless, uninterrupted trip from Anchorage to Scotland. There was no record of a data loss, no record of an uncommanded turn, and no record of a steep descent over the Arctic ice pack. The doctors at the airline's medical clinic told me I had experienced an episode of severe high-altitude microsleep, a brief neurological lapse where the brain enters a deep dreaming state while the eyes remain open, brought on by extreme fatigue, circadian rhythm disruption, and the hypnotic environment of a quiet night cockpit. They gave me a mandatory 2-week leave of absence, recommended a course of sleep therapy, and assured me that my career was completely secure. I want to believe their diagnoses. I want to accept that the orange data box, the glowing blue circle, and the sound of the ocean rushing past my cockpit windows were nothing more than the vivid, terrifying fabrications of an exhausted mind. But I haven't been back in an airplane since that night. I resigned from the carrier the following Monday, giving up my captain's bars and my pension without a second thought. I moved to a quiet, landlocked town in the Midwestern Plains, a place where the horizon is flat, the soil is dry, and the sky is just a harmless expanse of blue air. I thought I had managed to escape the protocol. I thought I had left that invisible frequency behind over the crown of the world. But yesterday afternoon, I was cleaning out an old storage closet in my basement when I found my old aviation flight bag, the heavy black leather case I used to carry with me on every international route. I hadn't opened it since the night of Flight 804. I unzipped the main compartment, expecting to find my old paper charts, my logbook, and my spare headsets. The bag didn't contain my gear. Resting deep inside the black leather interior, its surface covered in a thick layer of fine, crystalline frost that didn't melt under the warm basement lights, was a heavy metallic component. It was a small, circular hydraulic actuator valve from a Boeing fly-by-wire control system. And stuck directly to the frozen metal with a piece of faded maintenance tape was a small, handwritten label left by a corporate engineer. The label didn't list a part number or a repair date. It listed a single line of text written in my own handwriting. It said, "Biological backup successfully replaced. Do not reopen the flight deck." I am sitting in my living room right now, watching the sun slowly dip below the edge of the prairie. The sky is turning a deep, starless black, and the air inside my house is starting to feel incredibly thin, cold, and dry. And if I sit perfectly still in the quiet of the evening, I can hear a sound starting up from deep within the walls of my kitchen. It isn't the hum of my refrigerator, and it isn't the sound of the wind outside. It is the distinct, rhythmic, low-frequency drone of 2 massive jet engines running at maximum cruise power, accompanied by a faint, digital sonar ping that repeats every 4 seconds. They aren't done with the flight, and they are still waiting for me to take my seat.